The autumn wind carried the scent of approaching winter across the New Mexico territory, and young Thomas McKenna felt it bite through his thin cotton shirt as he made his morning rounds. At just 10 years old, Thomas had already learned what it meant to be poor on the frontier. His father had died 2 years earlier from a rattlesnake bite, leaving Thomas, his mother, and his baby sister to survive on whatever they could scrape together from their small plot of land and the few dairy cows they managed to keep alive. Thomas's mother worked herself to exhaustion taking in laundry from the soldiers at the nearby fort, while Thomas tended the cows and sold what little milk they could spare. Most days they barely had enough to eat themselves, but the milk brought in just enough coin to buy flour and beans. Every penny mattered. Every drop of milk was precious. It was on one of these morning rounds, as Thomas led their best milking cow Bessie back from the creek, that he saw the man lying beneath the cottonwood tree. At first, he thought it might be a drunk from the fort, but as he drew closer, his heart began to pound. It was an Apache warrior, and he was clearly dying. The man's leg was badly injured, probably from a bullet, and the wound had festered. His lips were cracked and bleeding from thirst, and his breathing was shallow and labored. He was maybe 30 years old, though suffering had aged his face. His eyes flickered open as Thomas approached, and for a moment, boy and warrior simply stared at each other across a divide that had been written in blood for generations. Every instinct Thomas had learned on the frontier screamed at him to run. The Apache were feared throughout the territory. Stories of raids and violence were part of every conversation at the general store. His own father had kept a rifle by the door specifically because of Apache threats. This man, even dying, represented everything Thomas had been taught to fear. But as Thomas looked at those fevered eyes, he didn't see a monster. He saw a man suffering, a man who would be dead before nightfall without help. And Thomas, despite being only 10 years old, despite being poor and hungry and afraid, couldn't walk away from that. He ran back to the barn and grabbed the small pail of fresh milk he'd just collected. Milk that was supposed to be sold that afternoon to buy dinner for his family. His mother would be furious. They couldn't afford charity, couldn't afford to give away what they needed to survive. But Thomas's hands moved before his mind could catch up with all the reasons this was foolish. He knelt beside the warrior and carefully lifted his head, bringing the pail to his lips. The man drank desperately, milk spilling down his chin, and when he'd had his fill, his eyes met Thomas's again. This time there was something different in them. Confusion, perhaps, or recognition of something unexpected. Thomas knew he should leave then, knew he'd already taken too big a risk. But he couldn't stop himself from pouring water from his canteen onto his kerchief and cleaning the man's wound as best he could. It was badly infected, beyond what Thomas's limited knowledge could help, but he wrapped it with strips of cloth torn from his own shirt anyway. "I'll come back tomorrow," Thomas whispered, though he had no idea if the man understood English. Then he ran home, his heart hammering, already dreading the conversation with his mother about the missing milk. But Thomas didn't tell her. He said he'd spilled it on the way to town, and took the scolding and the missed dinner that came with his lie. That night, he lay awake wondering if the warrior was already dead, wondering if he'd wasted their precious milk on a corpse. The next morning, Thomas crept out before dawn, bringing another small portion of milk and some of his own meager breakfast, a piece of cornbread he'd hidden in his pocket. The warrior was still alive, though he looked no better. But he drank the milk and even managed a few bites of cornbread. Thomas cleaned his wound again and brought fresh water. This continued for 6 days. Each morning, Thomas would bring what little he could spare. Milk, bread, sometimes just water. He never told his mother, never told anyone. The warrior grew slightly stronger, though not much. On the 4th day, he spoke, his voice rough as gravel. "Why?" he asked in surprisingly clear English. Thomas didn't know how to answer. "You needed help," he said finally. "I am Apache. You are white. We are enemies." "You're just a man who's hurt," Thomas replied with the simple logic of childhood. "My pa always said a man's measured by what he does when nobody's watching. I guess I wanted to measure up." The warrior studied him for a long moment. "What is your name, boy?" "Thomas McKenna, sir. I am Goyathle. Your people call me by another name, but that is who I am. And you, Thomas McKenna, have a good heart in a world that does not reward such things." On the 7th day, Thomas arrived to find the spot beneath the cottonwood tree empty. The warrior was gone, leaving no trace except for a small leather pouch hanging from a branch. Inside, Thomas found a beautifully carved wooden bird and a single eagle feather. He hid them in his room, treasures from a secret he could never share. 2 weeks passed. Thomas tried to forget about the warrior, tried to return to his normal life of poverty and survival. His mother had noticed he seemed thinner, that food was disappearing, but she was too exhausted to investigate thoroughly. The first frost came, and with it, the fear that they might not have enough supplies to make it through winter. It was a Tuesday morning when Thomas heard his mother scream. He ran outside to find her standing frozen in the yard, staring at the road that led to their small farm. Coming toward them, spread across the landscape like a living wave, were Apache warriors. Thomas stopped counting at 100. There might have been 400, maybe more. They came on horses and on foot, armed with rifles, bows, and lances, their faces painted, their presence absolutely terrifying. Thomas's mother grabbed him and his sister, pulling them toward the house, but before they could reach the door, the warriors had surrounded the property completely. There was no escape, no hope. This was the end, and Thomas knew with sick certainty that it was his fault. He'd helped that warrior, and somehow this was the consequence. A warrior rode forward from the group, and Thomas recognized him immediately despite the passing weeks. It was Goyathle, sitting straight and proud on a painted horse, his leg wrapped but clearly healed enough to ride. Behind him came an older man, clearly a chief of great importance, wearing an elaborate headdress and ceremonial clothing. Goyathle dismounted and walked directly to Thomas. The boy's mother tried to pull him back, but Thomas stepped forward, ready to face whatever judgment was coming. If his kindness had brought this doom on his family, he would not hide from it. The warrior knelt so he was eye level with Thomas, and when he spoke, his voice carried across the silent gathering. This boy, when I was dying, brought me milk his family could not afford to lose. He brought me food from his own mouth. He tended my wounds with cloth torn from his own shirt. He did this knowing I was Apache, knowing I was his enemy, knowing he risked everything. Goyathle stood and turned to address the assembled warriors. This boy has more honor in his small body than many warriors I have known. He gave when he had nothing. He showed mercy when he had been taught only to fear. The old chief rode forward and dismounted. Through Goyathle he spoke. I am Chief Cochise. The man you saved is my sister's son, nephew of my blood. You gave life when you could have given death or simply walked away. You gave food from your own hunger. This is the highest honor among our people. What happened next left Thomas stunned. The warriors began to dismount, and one by one, they came forward bearing gifts. Some brought food, smoked meat, dried corn, beans, and vegetables. Others brought blankets and warm clothing. Several brought firewood, splitting and stacking it beside the house in a pile that would last all winter. A group of warriors examined their barn and quickly repaired the roof that had been leaking. Others fixed the fence that Thomas had been unable to mend properly. They brought 3 milk cows, far healthier and better than Bessie. They brought chickens and a rooster. They brought seeds for spring planting. They brought tools and cooking pots and a rifle with ammunition. They brought everything a poor frontier family would need to not just survive the winter, but to thrive. Thomas's mother stood weeping, unable to comprehend what was happening. Warriors who she'd been taught to fear were saving her family from the starvation she'd been dreading. The cultural divide that had seemed absolute was being bridged by the simple act of a child who'd seen suffering and responded with kindness. But the greatest gift came last. Chief Cochise himself approached Thomas and placed around his neck a pendant made of turquoise and silver, clearly a treasure of great value. Through Goyathle, he spoke directly to the boy. This belonged to my father's father. It marks you as a friend of the Chiricahua Apache, now and forever. Any Apache who sees this will know that you are under our protection, that your family is our family, that your enemies are our enemies. You saved one life, and so 400 warriors came to save yours. Goyathle added his own words. What you did, small one, was not small. In a world where men kill for land, for gold, for pride, you gave from poverty to save an enemy. This is the mark of a great spirit. You will grow to be a man of honor, and we will remember you." Then, as quickly as they had come, the warriors departed. The entire visit had taken perhaps 3 hours, but in that time, Thomas's life had been transformed. Where there had been poverty, there was now abundance. Where there had been fear, there was now protection. Where there had been only struggle, there was now hope. That night, as Thomas sat with his mother and sister around a fire built with gifted wood, eating stew made from gifted meat, wrapped in gifted blankets, his mother finally asked him what she'd been too shocked to ask before. "Thomas, what did you do? How did this happen?" So he told her everything, about finding the dying warrior, about giving away their milk and his food, about the secret he'd kept for nearly 2 weeks. When he finished, his mother was crying again, but this time with a different emotion. "Your father would have been so proud," she whispered. "He always said that being poor doesn't mean being small, that having nothing doesn't mean you can't give something. You understood that better than most men ever will." Years later, when Thomas was grown, he would tell this story to his own children. He would explain that in that moment beneath the cottonwood tree, he'd made a choice that defied everything he'd been taught about enemies and differences. He'd chosen to see a human being in need rather than a threat to be feared. And that choice had rippled outward in ways he never could have imagined. The pendant from Chief Cochise hung on their wall for 3 generations, a reminder that kindness, even when it costs us everything, even when it seems foolish, even when the world says we can't afford it, is never wasted. That 400 warriors came not to bring death, but to honor life, to honor a boy who understood something that many adults never learn, that we are all more alike than different, and that mercy given is often mercy returned, sometimes in ways more magnificent than we could ever dream. Thomas McKenna lived to be 87 years old. He prospered, raised a family, and became a respected man in his community. But he never forgot that autumn when he was 10 years old and poor and chose compassion over fear. He never forgot Goyathle's words about having a good heart in a world that doesn't reward such things. Because the world had rewarded it. For 100 warriors strong, the reward had come, proving that sometimes, just sometimes, doing the right thing when it costs you everything can change not just your life, but the very story of what's possible between people who are supposed to be enemies.